Husovec. Very warm welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. You deal with the Digital Services Act. That's your expertise and your prominent position in the area. You have published a flagship monograph, 500-page long, Oxford University Press, 2024, and you also know the DMA. And this is very important for us because what we want to do is to learn about our sister regime, about the twin, but who moved to another continent and lives its own life. And DMA is so busy and DSA is so busy. So we somehow lose the track. So it would be great to use your knowledge and your understanding of both regimes. And so in this conversation, I wanted to invite you to explain the DSA and to look at its latest development, to look at its foundations maybe as well, but through the prism of a person who is primarily interested in the DMA, this kind of scenario. And the first question is, of course, is to tell us a little bit more about the book. So what is the purpose? How have you structured it? And what are the main messages if the book could have one single or several messages?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Olish. It's a great honor to be here and to share some thoughts with your audience. I do think that there's a risk that we're running is that and that is that we will be working on different policy files in isolation, not knowing what other area is doing. And there is some natural self-selection in how people tend to choose what they do. So competition scholars extend the interest to DMA. DSA is more interesting because it attracts completely diverse group of people, everyone from media law to IP to all kinds of other areas. But there isn't much overlap in terms of scholars that would be interested in both. Now, I'm not claiming that I can fully double in DMA, but yes, I maintain a lot of interest in DMA. And I think particularly on the institutional side of things, there are many common points and common challenges. Now, in terms of the book, so the book is, well, it's an attempt to retell the story of the DSA, what it's trying to do, but also ground it in a set of principles that I think are indispensable if we want to get this right. Because one of the problems with the area that the DSA is trying to tackle is that on one hand, I think the case is clear that a self-regulation is not sufficient in the European market. On the other hand, it's very difficult to structure the regulation in this space because it hasn't been done before. And there are so many tripwires that you can cross and so many sort of hidden problems that you can get into. So I think to do it well is difficult. And it's not just about designing the regulation well. I think certainly the DSA has its limits and flaws, but I think as a set of ingredients and instruments, it's a good approach. It's an incremental approach, but to see what it does, you have to see how the enforcers will actually conceptualize it. And I think this is where the principles come in. So the book is really essentially trying to position the DSA in the broader context, human rights, as well as generally internal market, and generally what we're trying to do, including with laws, sister laws like DMA, in this space. But at the same time, they're really going through, the guts of the DSA and try to understand what are these provisions really doing in a very detailed manner. And then again, zooming out and try to understand what the common principles should be for the regulators when they try to apply this law. So that's how it's sort of described it. It's a mixture of all kinds of genres from from a monograph to a textbook to a commentary to all sorts of things. I wasn't too concerned with how people will pigeonhole this. I did what I was interested in doing and what I found useful for a given moment.
And it is actually a very elegantly written book. So I must say that it was really a pleasant experience. I have spent quite a few hours reading, learning a lot from it. So thank you very much for enriching
Thank you.
the discourse with this book. Let us move to the regime itself. And when we look at the history of the DSA through the prism of the DMA, what we have noticed during the DMA discussion that a lot is because the text is not open-ended, but it's quite flexible in terms of or interpretive. A lot depends on who is interpreting it, and the stakeholders understanding the key interests of so we can easily map out the key players in the DMA
Yeah,
discussions. I imagine with the DSA, it's a little bit more complex, the
it's much more
reality.
complex.
Is there any
It is
chance
much
for you
more.
to map out what is at stake and who are the key players?
Well, everything is at stake. That is exactly why it's so difficult. So, when I say that, what I mean is that on one hand, what is at stake is um, whether the medium of digital communications survives in its current form. That is, it's a decentralized communication tool, mostly without editors, with a lot of freedoms. Um, and the regulation has this kind of a dual goal where on one hand it is limiting the expressions, including freedom of expression, because it tries to help the other laws that say something should be illegal, and it's trying to create a layer of enforcement for these laws in the digital space. But at a very same time, is actually also trying to facilitate that the users who use these tools have a better position vis-a-vis the private parties that provide these services, and hence their freedom of expression is enhanced through those procedural rights. So it's a kind of a dual goal. You, on one hand, try to give due process to individuals and more rights vis-a-vis private companies when they try to distribute their speech. On the other hand, you're also trying to help the state to better enforce its laws on illegality that they already have on the books, because the DSA itself is not does not include new rules on content that should be prohibited. That's something that remains outside of the DSA. So DSA is a kind of a layer on top. So it has a dual goal, and that already means that you attract very different stakeholders, right? So some people look at the DSA and they see an enforcement regime, right? They see, this is the way how we can enforce grievances in this particular area, how we can remove illegal content or even beyond. And then there's other group that looks at it and says, no, this is great. This is the new human rights charter for users online, because these non-state actors that previously didn't owe individuals too much now are forced to observe certain procedural rights. So from that perspective, for that group, it's a very important instrument that is actually enhancing freedom of expression. And then you have groups that are looking at it from more analytical perspective. This is a great way how to understand what is actually going on these services and what society is doing and how it's evolving. That would be the case of researchers or other public interest bodies. So I think there are really sort of so many different stakeholders here, and it's certainly much, much more colorful and broader than is the case in a DMA, where the set of stakeholders and perhaps the sort of trade-offs are often more crystallized, I would say. And I think in a DSA, that's exactly the challenge, is that so much is, it's so horizontal that it essentially covers the whole of society and all of its ills.
And indeed, this pyramidal structure somehow mitigates this duality of choice between being designated and not being designated. So I imagine that even the top of the pyramid, or if you look at it in terms of the escalating or escalating increasing the regulatory burden, the compliance burden, even those who've been designated to the highest level, they are not being polarized in terms of this discrepancy between their obligations and their direct competitors as much as they are being somehow not discriminated but selected carefully with the DMA.
Yeah, yes and no. Yes and no. So, um, this asymmetric design, the idea that there are some obligations that come up with just because you operate the type of service, and then others are added based on your size, and others added on this based on your systematic importance for the European society. I think clearly helps, right? Because it puts the companies in different tiers, right? So a small company, a micro business operating something that otherwise would be regulated as an online platform isn't regulated as an online platform because it's exactly a micro business. So I think that helps in creating a level playing field, and certainly helps in reducing the demands on particularly smaller services. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't certain obligations that maybe require tinkering going forward, that they might be still maybe a little bit broad for the tier in which they are. But I think generally that's the design idea. However, we still have big questions about sort of level playing field. So one of the problems is for the companies within a tier. DMA is much more sort of effects based in its assessment before someone is designated than the DSA. For the DSA, the threshold is the only thing that matters. So which makes the threshold incredibly important. And that also means that if the counting of users is not done in the same way by different competitors, that can undermine sort of the level playing field. So there's that problem. I mean, that has a fix, which is the Commission can give them more guidance. It can issue a delegated act on user counting, which I think probably is inevitable. But still, interestingly, there are some complaints about level playing field, for instance, when it comes to relationship between the market players that operate as a retail business and online businesses that operate as a retail online sellers, and those that operate as marketplaces. So the concern is that if you have a big retailer that maybe even sort of exceeds 45 million, it might not be regulated as onerously as an online platform. And the reason is because the latter has user-generated content, which is essentially what attracts this regulatory tax. So I think I don't think we're completely gone away from the concerns within the tiers. Even VLOPs, they're a very different company exactly because we don't do any sort of assessment of effects. So on one hand, you have obviously Meta and Google, but on the other hand, you have Wikipedia, Pinterest, Snapchat, right? So those are very different companies. So I think we still do have those concerns, but we have to accommodate them within the regime. I think that I think is slightly different from, say the DMA setup.
I have several questions about the mechanics of the DSA because it is much more advanced in terms of the current affairs, given that it covers much more horizontal, much broader scope of addressees. And yet I wanted just to, for the sake of the clarity of the strategic objectives of the DSA, we hear within the DMA discussions, people say that one of the objectives of the DMA is to improve incrementally the situation, the level playing field, by imposing obligations, so to focus on the substance of the obligations. And others say that in addition to this humane mission, it also has more strategic objective of tailoring markets. By imposing heavy obligation, you can somehow use it as a leverage to allow the greater opportunities to enter, at least. Or maybe others see it maybe even broader or differently. In terms of the DSA, is it only focused on improving the markets, or this strategic market design elements are there? And if yes, in what form?
I don't think it's focused really much on improving access to markets. In fact, I think people would say because it's a compliance issue, it increases the barriers to entry. But I think that is a little bit too simplistic, because so first of all, so DSA is an internal market measure, meaning that it could reduce the barriers to it could reduce the entry to the market because it actually reduces fragmentation. Now, obviously, people is going to say, what if you have national legislatures not respecting preemption? What if you have this and that? I mean, that's a problem. But in terms of the regulation, creating a fully harmonized a system that avoids fragmentation, that's clearly a win that should increase the market entry. That could encourage market entry. Plus, I think it's sometimes also what is forgotten is that it preempts a lot of national fragmentation, but also because it's a regulation, it actually is something that is offered to everyone, not just those who are established in the EU. So, previously we have a country of origin principle. This would be only something that EU-based companies could benefit from. Now it's anyone. So actually, there is a big harmonizing effect that avoids fragmentation and potentially reduces the transaction cost of entry. Now, of course, at the same time, we are raising the barriers of entry because we are imposing some regulatory obligations that did not exist before, and that's the cost. Now, you could say because of these tiers, we are in fact trying to be gentle and be mindful of the fact that companies find themselves in a very different situation if they are micro, small, or very large. And of course, you can certainly criticize the design and say this is maybe inappropriate for this particular tier. But I think in terms of the design, it's clearly present there as well. I think so. I would say I don't think though I would say the goal is to dose the compliance and the expectations in terms of compliance, and the core consideration is the safety and trust of users and predictability of an online environment. It's not about sort of the market entry as much. So it's more like what is the minimum industry sort of level of compliance if you enter this industry, which didn't exist before. And it's not really about incentivizing, more companies to enter. Though I think a lot of aspects of DSA will have the effect of actually inviting more players to the market because we are harmonizing certain features, say how content moderation is conducted on a procedure level. I think what we are essentially inviting is we're inviting many vendors to come and become suppliers of partial or fuller solutions for companies to comply with the regulation. So something that has had no common frame before, and it was hard to develop standards, and hence was hard to have many suppliers supplying many firms at the same time, and you had companies much more developing their own solutions. Now turns into a market where many vendors are coming in and offering tools, compliance tools to companies. So there are these effects, but I wouldn't say this is meant to improve the entry on the original market, that is the market for the digital services. I mean, it reduces the barriers to entry to some extent by the fact that it harmonizes, but at the same time increases it because it actually imposes something that did not exist before. And it's hard to say whether that's better or worse than the alternative because you don't know what the alternative would be. The alternative is 27 member states coming up with their own laws. They could be much more draconic or it could be much more lax, and you don't know. So if you knew what that is, then I can tell you whether that's reducing the barriers, but we don't know because it's preempting it in infancy, right? So I don't think the goal is really that, but it has some side effects on this. Now, I think how it sort of works with the DMA, to me, I think the interesting example is the App Store, and I use that example also in the book, where you can obviously take Apple and celebrate them for their compliance and sort of safety related work, because they're one of the two oligopolists on the market of the marketplaces, app marketplaces, and say, well, they're doing a good job because they don't have big regulatory expectations in terms of how they need to conduct themselves, but yet they do this, and this is to the benefit of everyone. And if you weaken their power, that means you will weaken their power to do that as well. And I think this is where the DSA comes in, because if you try to improve the entry to the DMA and have more competitors, it's just natural to then say, okay, but we have some minimum expectations from everyone who enters. So I think that's how the two sort of then get to build one, in my view, coherent picture, but people pitch it as a completely contradictory goals. In my view, it makes complete sense if you say, well, maybe oligopoly has this beneficial effect of coming up with some minimum safety and trust types of compliance, But we can also get there through imposing that through regulation as a minimum on everyone, and then try to open up the market that is a oligopolistic market at the moment. So I don't think they're contradictory, and I think they, in a way, are really compatible in its goals. And in many other areas where the same problem arises, like you have the problem with the interoperability mandates, right? Where the argument again is the oligopolies is stronger party in coming up with a superior security solutions, which is kind of a strange thing to say, because if you believe market is a better mechanism in coming up with a superior security solutions, then why would one company by default be always better in protecting your security? So you have that trade-off between the safety and competition there as well. And I'm not sure that it's always the case that I actually think that sometimes both the DMA and DSA can further the same goal, because if the DMA tries to open up through interoperability mandate, including open up the market on security services, that I think is also good from the perspective of what the DSA is trying to do, because it can actually increase the level of security. So anyway, just one of the examples there, but I probably went sideways with your question. Sorry about that.
No. I think it clarifies very important links and how the two regimes are mutually supportive, which is very helpful to see another example or more than one actually. Let us move to the functioning of the mechanism, because the mechanism is very complex. So I wanted to ask you, requiring many elements being well calibrated and fitting with one another, what's going on in the field, how much progress has been achieved within this very short period of time. Obviously we see how high expectations are raised by some commentators. They want from day one everything can function perfectly. And what is the reality in the 1 year plus?
Yeah, so I always say DSA is evolution, not revolution. And I think that you could say the same thing about a DMA, although it's novel as an experimental piece of legislation in both cases, but I think it's not, completely breaking with a pre-existing world. So from that perspective, I also believe that you should judge that the compliance as an incremental process. And you should be really cautious in expecting way too much on day one or year one, because companies are learning as they go as well. So if you believe that one of the central components, particularly for the big players, both in DMA and DSA, is dialogue, then I think clearly you can't be entirely satisfied on day one. In fact, if that was the case, it would be almost strange, because the fact that you adopt regulation doesn't mean that you yet convince the company to fully comply with it, right? So there's some companies in denial, other companies. I think in DSA it's less the case. I think I wouldn't say I see many companies in denial. On the contrary, but you see that in some of the DMA context, I would suggest. So I think in terms of what we have achieved, I think the challenge of DSA, unlike DMA, is that in order to work, it really has to have a broad ecosystem of different non-state players, trusted flaggers who notify content, out of court dispute settlement bodies that provide a solution to decide external appeals of users, researchers who get their hands on data and study the risks, auditors that help and audit the companies. So all these different institutions are necessary for the DSA to do a full job. So I always say that my first assessment actually looks at whether these institutions are being built bottom up in the member states. And I think the answer at the moment is yes, slowly they're being built up. We have certified trusted flaggers, around 10 of them. We have out of court dispute settlement bodies, I think 4 are now certified, and there are more in the process. We certainly have auditors involved in the audits and all of that. So I think institutionally, I think we're building up. Now, are there problems? Sure. You can imagine that this wouldn't be without problems. Now, in terms of how to judge what we have achieved in 1 year, I think you can take different sort of metrics, right? You can look at institutions and say, well, are institutions in place? I think we're getting there, but they're not fully there. There are some, even DSEs, local regulators, not fully equipped with powers yet. Um, and we might be missing some institutions in terms of transfer flaggers, maybe, et cetera, et cetera. Researchers are still not getting access to the vetted researchers are still not getting access to data because Commission has to still adopt a delegated act. So there's a lot to be built there. I think one of the things that is, I think, for me emerging clearly is that the big problem that particularly the Commission will have is to change the thinking into ex ante regime. So the entire toolkit in terms of the enforcement is built of competition law. The staff, probably predominantly, I don't know, I haven't done the study, but that's kind of my my feeling, is coming from the competition law and enforcement. That's great, but that is ex post thinking. And I think if you want a dialogue, it's a very different type of thinking. And I don't know if it will be easy for the Commission in particular to make the change in the mindset and become more ex ante regulator, say like Ofcom in the UK, which presupposes that you give more guidance, that the dialogue is not immediately structured around enforcement, and things like that. And I think that I see as one of the key challenges going forward. And I think on that, I would say we have to see with the change of leadership. I think the previous commissioner wasn't particularly helpful in establishing ex ante regime, if I can say it this way. So I don't know if the change of leadership changes that, but I think that's one of the challenges. Now I understand also that a commission wants to establish the regime in both cases, wants to be taken seriously, which means it needs to show the stakes. But then if you want to have a dialogue in the long run, I think, it's impossible to be both at the same time, be sort of someone who enforces all the time, but at the same time is also expecting the dialogue, right? I think that's like you need to do the very strategic dosing of the coercion and persuasion, and I think that will be the difficult one for everyone involved. And I think it will be also a difficult one because this hasn't been done before, particularly hasn't been done by the Commission. So I see that as a main challenge, which might surprise you because you would expect, okay, the challenges in interpreting some of the obligations. I mean, yeah, sure, there are issues, but I think for me, this kind of a supervisory relationship, particularly for VLOPs, is perhaps a little bit more challenging one.
And is
So
it
yeah,
on the last point, which is music to my ears, uh, do you see that that there are two approaches within the commission with DigiConnect, that some are more focused, more interested in more kind of punitive elements of the DSA, trying to put enforcement first, and others try to set up much more nuanced, much more uh, sophisticated, less stable,
yeah.
subjective mechanism of regulatory dialogue? Are they in
Yeah,
an antagonistic relationship, or it's all
I'm afraid
emerging?
there would be pure speculation. I'm not privy to any of the debates on this, so that would be purely speculating. I don't know. The only thing I can do is observe as everyone else what is happening from the outside, which is there is a barrage of enforcement actions that a commission has started under the DSA, many RFIs, something too many RFIs, the industry obviously. The the outcome is many pending many investigations, and a single point of guidance so far on the electoral integrity before the European elections. There are other pieces currently pending, but certainly compared to, say, Ofcom, the Commission is not particularly active on the field of giving guidance. I think that's probably fair to say. It's much more active on the front of sending RFIs and doing the enforcement actions. So I think from that you can see that that's prevailing approach. Now, what exactly drives this? Is this the leadership? Is this the attitude? Is this something else? I have no idea. Again, I don't see necessarily the fact that you do enforcement as a critical problem. I do understand that you want to establish authority, but I think it clearly is a trade-off with the dialogue, right? So I don't think it's possible to do both. I mean, that's what I say in the book, and the book was completed way before any of the investigation started, where I basically draw on the regulatory theory and say, look, you have to be very strategic how you dose the persuasion element of your work and the coercion element. And clearly, in order to be able to get cooperation, you need to enforce a certain tit for tat strategy. Meaning, if you see transgression, you go quickly after it and you use a stick. But cooperation, for most part, emerges from persuasion. So I use the example. I use the example with children. And some people dislike that because they think VLOPs are not children. But I think every parent knows that it's impossible to coerce your children to do everything that you want them to do. So the only way I can do it is you strategically use coercion, and you hope that that will the red lines that you try to enforce will elicit some sort of cooperation on other things where they will be simply persuaded by whatever you want them to do. So, and I think it's the same trade-off, and it's nothing new. This is this is what regulatory theory says in all kinds of areas, and I think this is a challenge for the Commission, and the cooperation bit is the ex ante bit, right? I think, and that's something that I think won't be as easy to build because there's no precedent for it, as far as I can tell, in some other context. And as far as I can tell, that's also a problem for DMA.
Absolutely. I'm tempted to go on with in this trajectory, asking how powerful the Commission could be against these dragons who, once you put your gloves on, they can immediately knock you out for a long time. But let us pause here because that would be purely speculative. I hope we have other opportunities to talk about these issues. On the mechanics of things, we have not many, but already quite a few undertakings being designated under DMA. With the DSA, it's a different. So how the process is going in terms of numbers, not necessarily concrete numbers because it changes, but in terms of the proportions, designation, compliance reports, does it exist? Digital services coordinators, you have mentioned already that most of them have been already assigned by member states. What's the situation?
So institutional setup is that a commission has a very strong position because it has exclusive competence over a special set of obligations that only apply to the designated very large online platforms and very large search engines. It doesn't mean that it's exclusively supervising them, because the country of origin, so the country of establishment of that specific VLOP or very large online search engine, is co-supervising and co-enforcing the DSA, but it cannot enforce the special obligations, which the most important of which is risk management, which is most open-ended of all, which is this kind of like opening for the dialogue about risks. So Commission has a very prominent role because it's a centralized enforcer that has an upper hand. So if the Commission wants, it can always take a case from the national DSC when it comes to VLOPs. But for non-VLOPs, Commission has zero competence. So that is an interesting split as well, that a Commission only sees big guys and always applies DSA only against big guys, while on all the tiers of obligations, while the national DSCs see big guys if they have them in the jurisdiction, or smaller guys, which the Commission never sees, only hears about through the board on sort of the European Board on Digital Services. So I think that's institutionally the setup. So national regulators are key for when it comes to enforcing with respect to the other players, not the big guys, but also with respect to big guys to the extent that they are establishing their jurisdiction. So that's one important element. Now, in terms of how designation process works, essentially the key component is you are a regulated service that is either an online platform or a generalist search engine, and you have 45 million monthly active users in the EU. And the key issue here is the threshold, how exactly you count this methodology. This is a little bit in flux. Essentially, the first designations were mostly about companies outing themselves. I mean, they have an obligation to basically publish the numbers, but in all these cases, basically companies themselves said, we reached a threshold. Now, we have two cases that for different reasons try to challenge designation. One is Amazon case, which I think is much more aspirational. It's much more about trying to review incidentally some of the parts of the DSA as it's to its validity. And then we have Zalando case where I'm involved. So disclosure representing consumer organization and intervening on the side of commission, which is much more about the scope of the services. That for which we count the users and how exactly we count users with our accepted and unacceptable methodologies. So then we have a next sort of batch of designations that concerned the adult sites, pornography websites, including user-generated pornography, and in these cases, there are pending cases as well against the designations, and these are much more about methodology, and that is about how exactly the Commission has done the methodology when designating them. So those are the cases that we have related to designations. Now, as you can see in this process, unlike in the DMA context, there's no correction mechanism for, if 45 million monthly active users over includes someone, there's no way to exclude you, right? You reach the numbers, you're in until you lose the numbers. That's the only correction mechanism there is. Unlike in the DMA where you can do the investigation as to whether you should be really designated. I think this is exactly what happened with X, right? So, so I think that's I would say the key difference. So the number counting matters much more for the purposes of the DSA because that's the sole criterion, which leads to the designation. But the dynamics that happen after the case is filed before the court against a designation, I think are very similar in both cases. Both in terms of interim measures, in terms of the review, incidental review of the validity of the legislation, in connection to these cases, I think that's quite similar. So what Apple is trying to do in its case is very similar to what Amazon is trying to do in the DSA case. It's an incidental review of the constitutionality of the provision that is triggered by the designation. So that's the same. So I think before the court, I think that it's probably more likely that we see the same practitioners that represent that. But before that, I think there's a bigger split in terms of who really does the DMA and who does the DSA, as far as I see it so far.
Okay, let me try to visualize for myself this difference, or not, or similarities rather. With the DMA, we have designated undertaking with the status of gatekeeper, and on annual basis, they have to submit compliance reports. And non-confidential version, the summary of these reports are accessible to all of us, so we can examine the significant part of it at least, and to see how meaningful this compliance are perceived by the gatekeepers themselves. And we have around few dozens of core platform services reports on specific issues.
Yeah, so we have 2 dozens of VLOPs and 2 very large search engines. And these are under an obligation to conduct an annual risk assessments, which have to be submitted to auditors. Auditors review them, and then everything is submitted to the commission, and the public also receives a redacted version of this, which should happen actually for the first time in a couple of weeks. But the companies are actually under an obligation to not just assess the risks annually, but on an ongoing basis. So there are additional assessments, risk assessments they might need to do for some new features in some cases. So in that sense, there is that is the analog in the DSA. I think the DSA is probably much more onerous compared to the DMA, but it's also much broader, right? So that already tells you that there will be much more cost in complying with that.
Okay, the category of risk assessment, I know you mentioned it in the past that it's one of the core substantive issues to examine and to figure out what should be considered within the scope of these reports. What is risk assessment? What should they consider? How far they can go with the issues which they have to assess in order to say how risky they are? What are the benchmarks? How laborious this process should be?
Yeah, so all of those are open issues. In terms of the scope, it's really all the risks related to illegal content, all the risks related to fundamental rights, and a few other things like elections and well-being of individuals. So it's extremely broad. Um, the system has a sort of a two prongs. One is procedural, which is about you have to think about this, and you need to document that you have thought about this. And the second prong, you need to act upon the risks that you identified in some proportionate, reasonable, and effective way. And I think the scope of it is more overwhelming maybe for the first one, for the procedural, that you can show that you have thought about everything that you should have thought about at the time. And one thing that can help companies is a consultation of civil society. So they are open themselves to others to give them input on things they should be thinking about. But once they think about those things, if they can document that they act upon these challenges in particular ways, that's kind of what is then required of them to do. And they document in these risk assessments that they go to the auditors, and then auditors review them as to whether that's now the details of all of these things that you have asked, from scope to the benchmarks and all of that, are heavily debated, and then we're missing many of those things because this is a completely new system, and there are often simply no benchmarks, right? So I don't know if you have to decide in timely fashion about notifications of users. It's unclear what that actually means. Well, it should mean something that that emerges as a good practice from the industry, but we don't have at this moment yet a good sort of indication of what that actually is. But the hope is that going forward, we'll get there, either based on the risk assessments or based on the transparency reports or based on what the researchers come up with in their findings. But that's kind of, I guess, one of the complaints about that system is that it's just so broad and so without guidance, that it doesn't give enough to companies to chew on before they actually develop their own approaches, which then means that if you have some expectations as a regulator which you haven't voiced in any way, you might get disappointed because they will not. I mean, it's quite likely that they will not conform to what you have expected, because obviously you can look at these things and implement them in so many different ways. And I think this is what we're going to probably see in November when these things come out for the first time, the redacted version of risk assessments on audits. And I think I expect that most people are going to be disappointed because they have imagined something different. But in absence of guidance, I also understand that you have to measure it you have to understand it as a attempt number one or attempt number zero, whatever. And I think for me, it's much more important what happens in 5 years or 3 years than what happens in year one. So yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's a long game, and we're just
Yeah.
setting up parameters. And obviously, the markets are changing quickly, and stakes are very high. But that's the maximum you can expect from the regulator in terms of how quickly the changes could be done in the meaningful and mature, robust way. But continue with this comparative visualization. So, in addition to risk assessment, I understand the starting point is that we have to bear in mind that only VLOPs and very large search engines are covered by the commission. So as you have
Yes.
reminded to us, because it's, and thus the commission has in their hands pretty much comparable size of addressees, the gatekeepers on one hand and VLOPs and very large search engines on the other. We know the obligations of the gatekeepers. We know the risk assessment. What else, in addition to risk assessment, are VLOPs and very large search engines expected to do under DSA?
So they're expected to sort of also meet the obligations for lower tiers, which are mostly, I would basically bucket them as, so first is content moderation related obligations. So how notifications are made, how users are notified about decisions, how they can appeal them, where they can appeal them, and how this happens. And second, transparency. So the obligations to issue all kinds of transparency reports, submit certain things to databases, create certain archives online of their ads, give access to researchers. So the transparency of that kind, transparency as to how they formulate their own policies, and then few obligations related to design that are actually detailed and not just sort of risk management. And those are, about how the transparency in the recommender system, or the opt-out options in recommender systems that is not based on profiling, or prohibition of certain types of advertising functionalities that would allow advertisers to target based on the sensitive personal data of adults or any personal data of children. So there's like a long list of, it's a laundry list that came from the legislative process where, there was a proposal and then you just keep adding stuff. Yeah.
Okay, I understand from kind of the structure of it that if this obligation, the second, the third, and the fourth tier obligations are mandatory also for smaller companies,
Yes, they're
for the
also
largest
public.
one, they are maybe, even if it's a burden, it's not very heavy burden, so it's doable in a sense.
Well, I mean,
If,
but I mean, industry will contest some of them for sure. I think, and some of them can turn out objectively actually being an issue in the long run, in terms of how costly they are. So I think jury's out on many of these things. I think, I'm not gonna pretend that I can predict what's gonna happen. So I think we should be open-minded.
Mhm.
Many do not appear to be too onerous, I would say, particularly for the VLOPs, but there's some that could become. Maybe not onerous to the extent that they would kill the company, obviously, but onerous to the extent that maybe the cost doesn't justify the benefit that regulation
Mhm.
tries to seek. And I think that we have to be open on, that we need to do that kind of cost benefit analysis at some point to see whether we actually should preserve this, at least in that particular scope, because sometimes it's a problem of scoping, right? So
Okay.
an example, so you can picture this. I don't know. We have out of court dispute settlement bodies, which are independent bodies certified by regulators who can hear appeals from users and notifiers who were unhappy with the decision of the provider. Now, the way it's set out at the moment, it basically says that a provider is paying for the procedure and user doesn't pay for the procedure at all, which means that for a single decision, if it's a complex case, you can be on a hook to pay, say, 700 euros as a provider. Now, you can appeal not just account level restrictions, meaning your account was suspended, but also individual posts that were blocked or deranked or something. Now you can see how potentially there are ingredients for potential misuse or ballooning costs of this type of the system. So you want to be really open-minded in watching the system and seeing the benefits that it brings, because there are undoubtedly benefits they can bring, but also the cost that this actually implies for the companies, and then at some point make the call. Do we want to preserve it in this scope? Do we want to limit it? Do we want to change the financing? What do we have to do? And I hope that happens, because we'll be foolish to think that we have devised a regulation that is flawless. Surely there are issues that should be on margins, amended at some point. And I think the time will tell. I think we have to see. It's at this point is experimental, and we should just watch and take notes.
On ballooning stuff, we see that a significant role is played under the DMA regime by vertical business users of some of the designated gatekeepers who sense where their market development has been limited and how much oxygen has been sucked out of their business by the gatekeepers. So,
Yeah.
but they are still powerful players who can articulate meaningfully their position and
Yes.
escalate it and make it very eloquent and visually appealing and convincing.
Yeah.
Do you have such powerful business users within the DSA system who could somehow say that we've been prevented by VLOPs and very large search engines for so long time, and thus now it's time to remedy and to raise their case?
You do, but the problem is they very often represent a single issue. So I think the typical example here would be copyright industry. So the content creator industry whatever, motion pictures, labels, I'm pretty sure that they will look at a DSA and try to articulate risks posed by the services to them and their bottom line as risks posed by illegal content, that is copyright infringement, and that will be completely correct. And I think that would be one of the industries that is likely to sort of try to use the regime in the way that you just described, that the companies like I don't know, Spotify or sort of app developers are doing in the DMA context. I don't think it's comparable though, because this is much more limited. I think for most part, in fact, we have the opposite problem, I would say, and that is that I think the interlocutors are much more in the DSA context, public authorities and NGOs. But when I say NGOs, I really mean all kinds of nonprofits, including nonprofits that sort of represent freedom of expression and fight for the user interests, consumer organizations that might do that as well, but also are interested in protecting consumers from, say, illegal, unsafe products. But then you have also NGOs that might have a particular type of policy agenda in the area of protecting rights of children, or even protecting, national security interests that might come from NGO, from the nonprofit, but it's bankrolled by a state actor. And you have state actors, obviously, as well. So authorities that want to actually enforce the rules. So you have all of those. I think, and the companies are just sort of competing companies are just part of the mix. I think for most part, competitors. Okay, so maybe another industry that has a clear stake is the news industry. So the news industry, and this was also visible in the legislative process, I think is another one that usually is quite unhappy with the fact that their content is being reviewed by platforms, because the refrain goes that we are editorial media, meaning we news sites, and why should the companies review us, whether that's against illegality or against the terms and conditions. So I think that's maybe one of the other industries is kind of analogous to the app developers in DMA context. But I think there's less of that. And I think it's a little bit more watered down and blurred by the presence of many other stakeholders with the completely different interests that have very little to do with the business. But there is a lot that the DSA does for businesses, right? So all the content creators that distribute via, I don't know, YouTube or social media or whatever, are users that benefit from the due process rights. I just don't think that for them it's such a big issue around which they would organize themselves, because it's not a defining issue. I mean, it can be a defining issue if your account is restricted in some systematic way, but it's not like it's not a core issue to your business, because you're asked to pay 30% tax on using a particular type of distribution method. So from that perspective, I think it's less of a singular issue for businesses, even though it does touch businesses and what they can do vis-a-vis the bigger services. So yes, they will surely use it, but I'm not sure, apart from few industries where there's a clear interest, that I would say I see that so far, but can change.
Okay, you have mentioned, moving to the end of the conversation, you have mentioned that we have to watch out the first release of reports, these redacted versions of the report. Do you expect some surprises in terms of some antagonization as we see with the DMA, or even where will be your focus? Will you be looking at different styles, how different designated undertakings perceive this mission, this duty, or maybe there are some substantive issues which you are eagerly waiting for?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I'm probably most interested in style and the level of detail and the approach that companies have taken and how they differ from each other. On the substantive issues, I don't know how much I will actually be able to understand the tiny substantive issues from the big assessment, because I think it's much more abstract than the one that you get under the DMA, because DMA zooms in on a very specific prescriptive obligation. And keep in mind here, it's about like how everything fits together and how it works or doesn't. So yes, you can have a benchmark for individual things like timeliness of notification stuff, but I think for most part it will be probably much more abstract read, I expect, than what you get say in a DMA context. So I'll be more paying attention, I guess, to the form and style, and I have no specific expectations really. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how I would do this, so I don't think I have that expertise. So I first want to see how other people have done it, right? And then I can make up my mind what I think about that. But I think I'm not going to pretend that I have like um, yeah, the perfect way how to do this. And if companies don't conform to that, that's a problem. And I don't think regulator can do that either. I think what I expect is a lot of headlines that companies haven't met their obligations, which might be a little bit unfair, because they certainly invest a lot of money in it. But that's what sells, right? The headlines. So there will be certainly headlines that the companies haven't done enough, and I'm sure some haven't done enough, right? So I'm not sure we will be able to judge from the risk assessments themselves, though. I think that's the difficult one. So I'm going into it with a complete open mind. I have no idea what to even expect. I have some sense of where this can go, but really don't know. But surely the headlines will be interesting. Whether they will be constructive, I don't know. I'm hoping that someone's going to do deep dive, even in the media, and try to sort of unpack these things, and that's what's going to happen. Hopefully, the researchers at the very least. Whether that changes the public discourse in any way, I don't know. I think we still haven't passed this sort of a tech clash or whatever we call this moment. That is justified to some extent, but you know, I guess I'm curious. I'm curious because and this is on a broader note. I mean, if you look at you know, general public debate is just becoming a more um, extreme on whatever topic it is, right? So I don't think this is particularly exempted. So I would expect probably that bombastic things sell better in terms of, you know, people being attracted to read things. So I don't know. But you know, I'm not a company. I'm not a regulator. I don't care about the headlines in that sense. But you ask me, what do I expect in the public debate? So I expect that in the public debate. Uh, but I don't take it as an indicator of much for me. I mean, I'm more interested in actually reading the details.
And actually, these details will because this is risk assessment categories are pretty much open-ended, and thus the substantiation of these open-ended categories will somehow pave the way to building up new substantive elements of compliance for the future. Maybe the commission itself will discover some interesting, hopefully, some interesting self confessions by some undertakings, which will attract their attention and thus opportunity to thematize. The last question in this regard is: do you think that the largest players themselves will be trying to weaponize each other's risk assessment reports and saying, "Look, our competitors have ignored this," because they're declaring the wars against each other, this inter-ecosystem competition more and more aggressively.
Yeah, I think I don't know. I can only speculate, but I would certainly think that if you are very disappointed by what your competitor is doing in terms of their saving resources on complying with something where you have invested a lot of resources, I think I could see how they at some point through some channels try to air that um, uh, air that unhappiness, right? Because you know, if you're investing several millions and someone else is investing a fraction of it, well, you have the same obligation and you're comparable in size. I think you might feel that this is unfair. So I think I always thought that that's actually one of the benefits, and then one of the things that a commission can use is to play sort of one against the other in the same category, obviously, because you can't compare pears and apples, but um, by essentially saying, look, if I don't know, Meta and Google are doing something and X is completely unwilling to do even the low hanging fruit, then I think that helps the commission vis-a-vis X if they can show that maybe not just the two that are much bigger, but also, I don't know, Pinterest does something and X is not willing to, even though, size-wise, maybe there's not such a big difference. So I think clearly a feature. You can compare it across the time, you can compare across the companies. Now, for that to be possible, though, you need some standards in terms of what the companies actually tell you. So you can actually say these are comparable things that companies report to me. And I think that's the challenge, right? But I understand that you cannot really expect it from the first iteration, maybe from the second and the following. But I definitely think that can be one of the aspects. I think there's clearly already a problem with respect to, and I think actually a bigger problem is with respect to where the Commission is not acting, or where the Commission is focusing its resources. It has limited resources, so by definition, it cannot act against everything that potentially could be in compliance. And well, it kind of gets me to my point about persuasion and coercion. So you have to pick issues, you have to pick the players, but also you pick issues, you pick players in terms of who you actually designate, right? Of course, if the companies out themselves and say, well, we have the numbers, of course you designate them. But if the companies are concealing that they should be designated, either because it's unclear how you define the boundaries of the service, so they count the numbers differently. So an example, Telegram. Telegram is suspiciously below the threshold, right? I don't know, I think they're like 2 million below the threshold, despite the global size and everything. And it has, I'm sure, everything to do with the way they count the users and the services that are relevant for the DSA in their view. So there are objective problems that exist there because Belgian DSE is not established yet, as far as I know, which makes it difficult for the Commission because it doesn't have its powers before the designation. But that's kind of an example of where, like, so on one hand, you're like pushing a lot on I don't know, some of the players that are investing millions, and then you have someone who is disrespecting orders, meaning not even willing to implement them. So, and I think that's clearly a challenge as well. And I think here it's actually much more difficult because to move the Commission to do something that it is not doing, it's harder judicially, right? So you can do it through other means, but judicially it's not as simple. So I see that as a challenge. And if I may, one other challenge I see, Olesh, and this could be interesting to your listeners, is the fact that commitments, I think, cannot work the same way for the DSA as they work for the competition law and can work for DMA. I think is the subject matter really should mean that that we're really much more cautious with them. And I tell you what I mean. So in my understanding, in competition context, if you have a commitment, if the company decides to do something, much more pro-competitive that the regulator could actually expect them to do, it's not a bad thing, right? Because it's a good thing, right? The consumers get a more choice, more competition. That's a good thing for consumer. However, in the DSA context, the company going beyond what the DSA allows the Commission to impose can equal you're doing it at the expense of an individual rather than you're doing it in favor of the individual. Because if companies say commits to not allow a particular type of expressions on its service, even though the expression is lawful, that is something that, in my view, the Commission cannot ask the VLOPs to do. However, what if a VLOP is willing to commit to that in the commitments? Now, if you take the logic of, well, the more is better, I think you would say, surely there's no need to review this. But I think when you take the perspective of the commitments based on the DSA, how could we possibly accept that we approve through public means something that actually the Commission couldn't enforce in the first place? And I think that is why the commitments, and I haven't thought about this enough. Clearly, I have to think about this more, but it strikes me as one of the really big differences that, if you maximize DMA enforcement, you might do it at the expense of the companies, their ability to appropriate and the investments and all of that, but you're not doing it at the expense of civil liberties most of the time. Although obviously there's some stakeholders that claim the other ways, right? If you have interoperability, you do it at the expense of privacy. I'm not convinced by that, but okay. But I think in DSA that's inbuilt. Like very often, if you do that, you do it at the expense of something else. So I think this really will mean that it will not be easy to run it as a single ship on some of these issues, and yeah, commitments are maybe just the first example. I'm sure there might be many others that might come.
So it's kind of DMA is minimal harmonization. Minimal harmonization DSL is kind of full harmonization. When you go beyond, you risk to encroach and do it at cost of something else.
And that something else could be a competence of the national parliament,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that can become a rule of law issue. So it's a very big and a consequential thing that you can stumble upon, not just disproportionality or something like that. So I think I think that's something that clearly I don't know how to operationalize it. Yeah, it's one of the things I've been thinking about lately, but I clearly is a feature that has to be taken into account. It cannot be run in the same way. I mean, there are no commitments under the MA yet, right? Are they?
Only for
No.
systematic non-compliance.
Yeah.
So in the original version, we have it for the first non-compliance instance of non-compliance, and during the parliament revision, they moved it only to systematic non-compliance, which is quite counterintuitive. I think it's a regulatory, it's a very helpful tool for regulatory dialogue, in my
Yeah.
understanding of things. But well, we will see. Again, it's experimental. We will see how it functions in reality. So, Martin, I wanted to close this conversation by asking you teach at LSE and thus have an opportunity to communicate with brilliant students, brilliant colleagues, and you definitely sense the trend in terms of competences, skills, profiles which the market expect from the newcomers in terms of new lawyers, maybe in the law firms, or maybe compliance officers, or maybe in-house lawyers, or maybe regulators, enforcers. Maybe you can provide some general recommendation, a couple of them, to students who want to be prepared, start preparing for this game, let's say having 2 years still ahead.
Yeah. Well, I think this is an exciting space for sure. Uh, um, I mean, the regulation creates jobs for lawyers. This is no secret. And I think the DMA and DSA do create many jobs for lawyers, whether that's in regulators, whether that's in uh, sort of vendors who help and supply solutions, consultants, auditors, uh, whether that's obviously law firms, they're doing litigation or advising, and whether that's companies trying to implement all of this, or and any business user that wants to take advantage of the DSA tools going forward, which is essentially, as I say, any company that's doing business online, as far as DSA is concerned, for sure. Um, so I think there's a huge demand for experts in this area. And I mean, I spent last 2 years training many people. Um, and I think we don't have nearly as many people as needed in this space. And in fact, the difficult thing I think that all of the players have, whether that's a regulator or whether that's a company or consultant, is that they're fighting for the same talent in a way, or law firms, uh, because of course, you don't have too many people that have knowledge. Now, you can obviously skill up by, reading the law and try to follow what is happening, take some executive courses. I offer one at LSE, and some online courses outside of LSE. There's some other people who might do the work on DMA. In Amsterdam, they run a summer school on platform regulation, and I'm sure there are other places doing this. Maybe you can provide them with links. But I think my general message, and this is what I'm trying to do this year with my own students at LSE, whether that's undergrads or postgrads, is to really essentially to take this as, this is an area where you can probably get the job the easiest compared to everything else, right? You want to go into IP? Sure, it's still a career option, but I'm sure there are many more jobs if you want to do DSA compliance. Um, and I think for that, what really helps is to have a little bit more holistic thinking. Don't just think about the law, think more broadly. Try to understand the industry, I think, is always the difficulty. It's I think IP and competition law are perfect examples of two areas of law that are impossible to do if you don't understand the industry. And I think the DSA and DMA are exactly the same. If you don't understand the industry, you don't understand what is happening, what are the dynamics, you will not understand what this law is trying to do, or what it can do. And I think that I think it's helpful when preparing for this. But yeah, my general message is this is a good area to start with, not just because it's exciting and you can build things that haven't been built before, but also because there's just simply a lot of demand for the expertise, and the market is hungry for that. So I think now is the good moment. And yeah, so that would be my message. Now, obviously, I'm preaching preaching my own field, so that is obviously not very objective, but I'm just observing what I see. I see basically people scrambling for resources and trying to find talent, and it's tough.
Martin Husovec, thank you very much indeed for this very informative and open-minded conversation.
Thank you so much, Olesh. This was great.